This is The Other Past, and today we're speaking with historian Guy McClellan.
10,000 people, like that magnitude.
At any given time?
At any given time. What the Los Angeles Times be called a Russian spy system. My job would entail some, quote, light bear duty. That's not a phrase you want to just let slide by without asking for some clarification.
Mr. McClellan is soon to be Dr. McClellan, and his PhD dissertation, which will likely end up becoming a book, focuses on Yosemite National Park in the 20th century. Guy is also a summer park ranger at Yosemite, and this background has enabled him to both get an inside perspective on the park's operations and make connections about the park that it would be hard to imagine anyone else making. So Guy, you've worked seasonally in Yosemite for over a decade in Tuolumne Meadows?
Yep.
And so, do you know the rest of the park?
Most people go to Yosemite to see Yosemite Valley, which is kind of the centerpiece of the park, or it has, like El Capitan, all the waterfalls. Most of my job working in Tuolumne Meadows, which is about a 90-minute drive from Yosemite Valley, is telling people how to get to Yosemite Valley. It's very, very unromantic view of it, but yeah, I work in the high country, so it's only open about 4 months a year, and then the office that I work in the Tuolumne Meadows campground, becomes a ski hut during the winters. So I kind of stay in the high country during the summers because, to be honest, Yosemite Valley is a little intimidating for me. It's packed with people, and this is an embarrassing admission, but I actually have to have people draw me maps of where I'm going in Yosemite Valley because I am just not at home there, and I don't know if that'll ever change. I mean, my parents have been taking me to Yosemite for a long time, but we always kind of went to Tuolumne Meadows, so I always kind of assumed that was the main part of the park, and then I slowly realized that I was wrong.
Yeah, the waterfalls in El Capitan are extremely iconic.
Yeah, they're kind of exactly what people come to see, but it's kind of sad. A lot of folks will come in like August. That's usually the busiest month of the summer, and depending on how thick the winter snowpack was, they'll actually arrive and find that the waterfalls are like trickling or really not doing anything majestic. So I'm often the person giving them that news as well.
But people come to Tuolumne Meadows as well, right? I mean, it's a beautiful place.
Yeah, and it's long been a destination for people, especially folks from, like, say, the Bay Area that, consider Yosemite more or less their backyard, that are looking to, like, escape the crowds. And so it was not until later that I kind of realized that my parents were, like, a part of that crew of people as well. They were kind of, I don't want to say hipsterish about it, but kind of being like, yeah, Yosemite Valley is like, it's part of the park, but it's a little overexposed. So we're going to go get some, high country wildflowers and like, lazing by the stream, like high peaks. It's a different vibe, but then again, Yosemite is like the size of Rhode Island, so it's to be expected that you will have a lot of different environments within that space.
Is that true, the size of Rhode Island?
Yeah, and I'm blanking on like the acreage or, the raw numbers right now, but that's kind of anecdotally how we, whenever somebody expresses bewilderment or even anger that they are in fact an hour and a half from Yosemite Valley, I usually lean on that Rhode Island fact to at least misdirect a little bit.
You know what I was looking up the other day is that LA is the size of South Carolina.
Oh, get out of here, really?
Yeah, seriously. If you look at the area on Wikipedia, at least, and Wikipedia is the internet, and the internet is not always accurate, but yeah, they're very similar in size. Talk about what you do at Yosemite, because that's kind of a broad term, is working at Yosemite.
Well, I'm technically a park ranger, which could mean any number of things, and I think people's imaginations tend to run wild and, point them towards like me scaling a cliff to save someone's life, and that's not at all the reality of my job. I'm a campground ranger, so I take people's money, for better or worse, and then assign them a space in which to camp. Tuolumne Meadows Campground is I think probably the largest National Park Service run campground. I think there are campgrounds like at Death Valley that are partially run by the concessioners that are larger, but I mean there's like 307 campsites in the Tuolumne Meadows campground, so there is like a fair amount of like ash cleaning, like rowdy camper chastening. Sometimes I get to chase bears. That's kind of fun. Yeah, so before I got the job and I was interviewing with the person that would become my boss, she mentioned that my job would entail some, quote, light bear duty. And I was really curious as to what that meant, because you don't want to that's not a phrase you want to just let slide by without asking for some clarification. I live in like a little, single layer plywood shack nearby with a canvas roof. But we still have electricity. We have a refrigerator. We use like a Coleman camp stove to cook inside, even though, kids, if you're listening, don't try that at home, because that is a dangerous thing to do indoors.
Professionals only.
So it's, I wouldn't say it's completely roughing it, but it's definitely a change of pace from my normal lifestyle.
You live in Albuquerque.
Duke City represent.
And so you're a grad student at University of New Mexico, and you are writing a history of Yosemite. In our prep conversation, we talked that it wasn't exactly your experiences that led you there. Like, what interested you enough to write a project about Yosemite?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is just being in the kiosk, or the booth, as we call it in the ranger biz, and processing, to use a very unromantic term, a lot of cars that are coming in and looking to camp. And to entertain yourself and to be like a gregarious host, you're often asking these people just kind of where they came from and how they got there. And so I kind of gradually developed this theory in my brain that, like, wow, Yosemite is not really this strictly bounded place as we know it, but it's also the sum of all these like highway corridors that convey people to the park, and even maybe the cities that kind of rest at the other end of those highways that supply so many of the visitors. So I got real intimate with kind of like the auto interface and overall like Yosemite's dependency on like automobiles and highways to provide a wilderness experience. So that was really kind of like the kindling, so to say, in the fire.
In California, you have the two major metropolitan areas of Los Angeles and the Bay Area, and then there's sort of the national visitors, and then there may be international visitors. Mm-hmm. There's kind of a draw to it that expands past California, but what percentages would you say of those groups end up going there?
It definitely changes through time, and it's not a statistic that, at least in my findings, has been consistently kept, but I would say anywhere, kind of at any time in the 20th century, between 75 and like 90% of all the park's visitors are Californians.
Wow. I would not expect that, actually, given the national park designation.
That's actually kind of a big reason why I started my project too, because I do agree that like national parks are part of a narrative of like federal power and land ownership in the American West, and that's not always super well received. But I do think that national parks are more dependent on, like they're shaped more by the states surrounding them than historians and popular culture tend to acknowledge.
Well, something like the Grand Canyon seems to attract like lots of visitors from all over the United States. Would you say that that's more of a non-regional park? I mean, obviously you don't work at the Grand Canyon, so... Yeah,
I've never seen visitor stats, like, comparatively for Yosemite versus other national parks, but I would say just, like, the sheer mass of humanity that can, highways basically pump from California's major cities directly to Yosemite. Arizona does not have that advantage. You can only access the Grand Canyon a couple of ways rather than Yosemite, which has, 4 main entrances.
And your project actually concerns the building of those entrances.
Yeah, or at least the processes that went on both within and outside of the park to kind of negotiate where these entrances should be, because that involves not only like federal bureaucrats, but also kind of local city level boosters that are trying to, vie to become the most convenient depot for rail travel or later automobile travel to the park. The park itself stays static, but people are kind of scrambling around it throughout the 20th century to provide, access that might please their constituents a little bit better.
So I know your dissertation starts in the 20th century, but I'm assuming the natural features of Yosemite formed a long time ago, like geological time. Can you give us a picture of what the park was like before it became a park?
Yeah, absolutely. I am an environmental historian by trade, which means it's kind of a common move for environmental historians to start with kind of like deep time or geologic time.
Yeah.
And that's not something that I do explicitly in my work, but as far as the valley goes, scientific controversy about how Yosemite Valley was formed is actually kind of one of the first reasons John Muir became famous. He was vying with the state geologist of California, Josiah Whitney, for whom Mount Whitney's named. Josiah Whitney thought that the bottom of Yosemite Valley essentially dropped out. That created the massive, 3,000 foot plus chasm that people come to see. But John Muir argued for the perspective of glaciation, so kind of gradual erosion, hundreds of thousands of years ago that eventually made the Merced River Canyon so pronounced. So that's like kind of the basic scientific history of the landscape. And as far as I guess kind of contrary to what a lot of narratives about the national parks would have you believe, Yosemite Valley and the park in general was completely inhabited before it became a national park. But slightly before the Gold Rush, California, the state inaugurated pretty much all-out war on Native peoples all around the state. It was kind of like a massive and well-funded effort at genocide.
Yeah.
And so the discovery, quote unquote, of Yosemite by white men in 1851 is actually a part and parcel of that kind of massive military campaign. And the Awanichis who are the traditional inhabitants of the park, they were there at the time that James Savage and a bunch of other men were essentially trying to relocate them forcefully to a reservation outside of the park.
Damn.
Yeah, so overall, I think if the native history of the park is super complicated, and I can't profess to be an expert, but anytime there's a claim made about wilderness in American history, I would advise everyone to be very careful and evaluate that claim not based on kind of the triumphalist narrative, like, oh, great, we found this place that's uninhabited, let's celebrate it. It's the formation of national parks was almost always accompanied by the removal of people who had lived there for generations, because in order for something to be wilderness, it had to be uninhabited, right? So wilderness was not discovered, it was actually made in many cases.
Well, not only that, but like areas like the Bay Area were inhabited by the various tribes that fall under the Ohlone umbrella, and Los Angeles was occupied by the Tongva, I believe. And it seems like many areas that, especially in California, that are now places were in fact places before that to Native Americans, to Indigenous Americans, like to an extreme degree.
Yeah, and you raise a really good point, maybe inadvertently by using the word place. I think anybody who's looking to do just basic historical digging to maybe find out a little bit more about the past of a place like Yosemite that has layers upon layers of, like romanticization and commercialization on it. The names of places is like a really awesome way to start, because the journals of this man, Lafayette Bunnell, who is kind of the chronicler of that Mariposa battalion that entered Yosemite in the early 1850s as part of an effort to expel the native inhabitants. A lot of his chronicle deals not just with violence against native people, but also kind of a more abstract form of violence by learning the native place names. For example, Half Dome, kind of another thing that everybody goes to Yosemite to see, was originally named Tisaak. And that's just one of many place names that has been kind of scrubbed from the historical record. So that's like another layer to the colonial project that I think really anybody can investigate if they're curious about. Yeah,
and that goes hand in hand with sort of the naming of suburbs in the West and in the United States, where it's like Babbling Brook Estates, but they paved over the Babbling Brook to make the estates. I wanted to briefly mention, just for listeners, that Manifest Destiny is well known as a term, and the frontier line basically spread westward from the East Coast as people settled the West, and it was the frontier line that moved westward. But after the gold rush, the frontier line actually moved inward from California. So what we're talking about aren't events that happened as the West was won. It's kind of like the far West was won earlier and moved inward, and that's probably what we're talking about when it reached Yosemite instead of coming from the east.
Yeah, that's actually something that I like to think of abstractly as like a wave kind of crashing against the western shore of the U.S. and then the ripples kind of refracting eastward. But yeah, that's a good point. It should be noted, and we can move on after this, but I mentioned before that August is kind of the high season for Yosemite's summer visitation. But it wasn't always that way. In fact, like the spring, April, and May were often, in the early 20th century, the most crowded months because that's when the waterfalls were like really going great guns. And the National Park Service, they inaugurated a kind of event called Indian Field Days, which was, as you might expect, not something that would fly today. It kind of clothed Yosemite's native history in a more generic, like Plains Indian garb. So instead of the traditional houses that the Awanichi would have lived in, there was teepees and all kinds of fringed buckskin clothing. So a very generic perspective of the concept of Indian. And that was a way that the National Park Service actually tried to kind of like extend the summer high tourist season till later in like July and August. Native identity, or really lack thereof, has always been a profitable thing for the National Park Service. I mean, we can talk, the Grand Canyon, for example, is well known for Hopi arts and crafts, but it's actually more closely aligned with traditional Havasupai territory. So it's kind of, the things that a park claims as its heritage and the actual heritage are often quite different.
That goes for kind of America as a whole. After this period that we're talking about, there was a big situation with Hetch Hetchy. And for those of us on the outside of this, what is the significance of that part of Yosemite?
Yeah, so Hetch Hetchy is kind of the one controversy that would kind of make Yosemite appear in a lot of history textbooks because it's like a teaching moment for all kinds of things, right? The ideas of conservation, like a sustainable harvest of natural resources, versus preservation, kind of, setting things aside for abstract reasons. But the nuts and bolts is most Californians know that in 1906, San Francisco was like basically destroyed by an earthquake and subsequent fires. And that was a pretty big deal, and they began beseeching the Department of the Interior to let them dam Hetch Hetchy Valley, which is kind of on the northwestern side of Yosemite National Park, but definitely within the park itself. And as you can imagine, that would be really controversial, right? So John Muir by this time had formed the Sierra Club. That happened in the 1890s. And so that was really the national preservation organization. And this was kind of a premier national stage for that organization. Kind of on the other side of the, I feel like I'm almost like a boxing announcer, right? Like, and in this corner was Gifford Pinchot, who had a really dope mustache, but more importantly was the first head of the Forest Service, which had been created before the Park Service, and he was an ardent conservationist. So he thought the natural world was to be used for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So there's not really a right answer in that equation, but you can see why that is a common fodder for most history textbooks.
Yeah, have you heard of NWAPA? You familiar with that? There was I'm pretty sure that's the acronym, but it was a project that would have crossed the Canadian border and filled in part of, I believe, the Rockies.
No way.
And would have served as a sort of hydroelectric giant water source for both British Columbia and the northwestern United States. Yeah, so that didn't go through, but it probably would have in that time. if we had the technology, for the same reason that Hetch Hetchy ended up happening.
Yeah, it's interesting that watersheds kind of were the original metaphor behind conservation and preservation efforts, like this really classic environmental history, Man and Nature by George Perkins March. It was published in the 1860s, and he was making the argument that the Adirondacks should be preserved because of their significance of providing the water for New York City. So that right there tells you a lot about early environmental protection efforts, is that there needs to be some kind of quid pro quo, implying that citizens, even urban citizens, would stand to benefit from the kind of abstract act of kind of preserving a natural landscape.
What would you call preservation for wilderness's sake?
That's a good question. I mean, people have done histories of kind of what they might call like wilderness advocacy or the wilderness movement, and I agree that they're definitely related, but they are separate. And there's a really awesome history called Driven Wild by Paul Cedar where he actually argues that the kind of National Park Service's real aggressive road building efforts in its early days was what prompted a lot of Americans to become wilderness advocates. So that's kind of an interesting bit of irony right there, right? We think of the National Park Service as solely built for preserving wilderness, but in its early years, I mean, it was only founded in 1916, and its first director, Stephen Mather, was like a self-made millionaire that actually bought parts of national parks and donated them to the U.S. government directly. And he was a huge fan of autos. He would have his superintendents travel to annual park conferences in auto caravans to kind of publicize the role of roads and cars in bringing people closer to nature, as it were. It's important to talk about Hetch Hetchy because it is really, like I said, the one signature moment where Yosemite will appear in a lot of history textbooks. And then after that, it kind of vanishes from the historical narrative. You know, it serves as kind of the park itself serves as kind of the origin story for national parks in general, and then it's almost like poof, after Hetch Hetchy, it doesn't exist anymore. And so that was something I identified pretty early on in graduate school, that I was like, that just seems like, you know, a very incomplete story, something that I'd like to elaborate on, you know. And same with John Muir. I mean, the guy you can't really deny that he had a passion for nature. Spoiler alert, that's actually the title of a famous book about him, so I just stole it, but thanks, Donald Worcester. It's a great book, you should read it. But again, he's not. There's not enough complexity in the way that he's portrayed, even though Donald Worcester's book goes a long way towards that. But Hetch Hetchy did really spark my imagination in terms of, like, when you think of the massive water infrastructure required to link San Francisco and Yosemite over 200 something miles of pretty variable terrain. I tend to think spatially, like that's just the abstract way that my mind processes information, relationships between places, no matter how close or far they are. And I started to think about other kind of more concrete, no pun intended, ways that highways might connect Yosemite with the rest of the state. And that actually became a pretty signature part of my research or my dissertation. And it was aided a lot through just conversations with visitors in the park, but also through, you know, the more I read about Yosemite, the more I realized that it was portrayed as this kind of isolated space, when my experience was the opposite.
Yeah, that really, that's a huge part of your dissertation, which basically, I mean, its story is told, if I understand it correctly, through the effects of separate actors on the park, and such as like the car in World War II. And it's a unique way to kind of tell a story about a place that we tend to think of as isolated. And did that structure kind of come naturally, or did you develop that further on?
Well, in the summer of 2013, I was researching my master's thesis in Yosemite's park archives, and I came upon this pretty interesting event in 1970 that is, I guess, commonly called the Stoneman Riot, and basically kind of at the height of the counterculture bureaucrats in Yosemite were really intimidated by the way that like young people were kind of swaggering into the park, like skinny dipping in full view of families. Skinny dipping if you're lucky. I mean, there's some like pretty filthy stuff going on in public. Using lots of drugs, drinking lots of wine. In general, kind of not being the ideal visitor core that the Park Service had really tried to cultivate. And so Yosemite superintendent identified a meadow kind of in the eastern end of Yosemite Valley where these young people that they would learn to call hippies only after that term was popularized nationally.
Yeah.
He identified that meadow and tried to impose a curfew on it. And basically it didn't work. And the park sent mounted rangers into the crowd of hippies kind of carrying axe handles, for lack of a better word, for weapons. And it was pretty much exactly a riot. Like hundreds of people were arrested, and kind of the park rangers' lack of preparedness for such a kind of like extreme example of civil unrest was really exposed. That's after that, the ranger profession really kind of diverged sharply into different branches, law enforcement being kind of the obvious one arising from that instance. But the whole chapter, I mean, aside from the violence is, you know, which everybody loves, is more about San Francisco's relationship to Yosemite and vice versa.
Yeah.
And that ended up being kind of the last chapter of my dissertation. And for all you folks out there that are thinking of writing a dissertation, do not do it in reverse order. It is not the jam. But that is how I ended up writing mine. And the hippies brought with them these really interesting comparisons, both from park personnel, journalists, and the public, that Yosemite Valley was an urban area. And so I decided to follow that thread backwards in time. And that is pretty much what led me to my project.
So if you don't mind, we could go through kind of the parts of your project.
For sure.
So spoiler alert, everyone, on these. So your first chapter is about the University of California and sort of the Bay Area as they relate to the park. And so was that the sort of initial actor that was involved with the park?
Well, so we're talking about Berkeley, which was kind of, synonymous with the University of California because it's kind of the flagship, right?
And what year are we talking here?
So my dissertation starts the same year that the damming of Hetch Hetchy was authorized, 1913, but I started there for a different reason. It's the year that the first automobile permit into Yosemite was sold. And for people that are interested in talking about economic history, I did the inflation math, and I think the first auto permit to Yosemite sold for $140 in today's dollars. So people do rightly complain about having to pay whatever they do to get into the park, but it was a lot worse 100 years ago. We can say that. But the University of California, Berkeley, really it employed as faculty a lot of people that were really important to the early years, not just of Yosemite, but of the National Park Service in general. And it also trained a lot of people, especially in forestry or other kind of natural resource management disciplines that would become massively important in the early years of Yosemite too. So I talked about Stephen Mather before, the kind of billionaire first director of the National Park Service. I should probably say millionaire. I'm not really sure if billions existed back then.
Well, he probably would be in today's dollars, right?
Exactly, right? So it's all depends. It's all relative. But he was a UC Berkeley grad. And in 1915, as he was trying to organize a conference of all this is a really confusing thing about national parks, but the parks themselves existed before the National Park Service existed. So basically the individual national park site existed before the umbrella organization. And one of Stephen Mather's big accomplishments was lobbying successfully for the creation of a centralized national park bureau within the Department of the Interior. And in 1915, he held this conference where all these important people like promoters, park superintendents converged on Berkeley, his alma mater. And Stephen Mather, because he had donated so much money to his old fraternity to get them a new fraternity house built, he kicked all of the fraternity brothers out and had all of these superintendents and publicists stay in that house over the course of 5 days. So this is, it's kind of like Animal House meets Dead Poets Society or something like that, something inspirational, So, UC Berkeley was also really crucial in providing kind of the scientific expertise behind the development of interpretive programs in Yosemite, which were kind of miles ahead of the rest of the nation. So like nature walks or like guided backcountry hikes, like, a native wildflower garden, and most importantly, a museum, which I argue is kind of the first step towards reorganizing the Yosemite Valley to be more of like an urban space that catered to the car. So UC Berkeley is incredibly important.
Chapter 2, I read a little bit of, and it is about Los Angeles and sort of the auto boosters, and I find that very interesting because Yosemite is not something I associate with the growth of the automobile industry, but you seem to make a pretty direct line there, and it's a good point.
Yeah, so I mentioned in 1913 it was a big deal for an automobile permit to be sold into Yosemite, but there was still actually a ton of restrictions on automobiles that wanted to enter the park. They could only enter the park one way, and during certain hours, they could only exit. They had to exit by a certain time each day. They basically had a curfew. There were even these kind of timing checkpoints so that rangers could ensure that cars were driving the right speed. So this is what the Los Angeles Times called a, quote, Russian spy system. And the Los Angeles in general at this time, kind of in the early 1900s, was really beginning a massive fight on all fronts to kind of unseat San Francisco as California's leading metropolis, or at least kind of be first among equals with that city. And Yosemite kind of became a theater of that battle. So this local organization called the Auto Club of Southern California, when they first started in the year 1900, they were basically like, advocating for like better training for chauffeurs and like more reasonable speed limits and really local stuff. But that quickly segued into kind of more spatially ambitious projects like signing roads that led into the mountains and kind of branching out into different parts of the massive like Los Angeles basin to offer essentially like what AAA does today, right? Like different branch offices that serve as really important sources of information. They would even send like scout cars up into the mountains to kind of give an idea of what the snow conditions were like, or like were the fish fighting. So we think of auto insurance, like today as very much just a like cut and dried proposition, but this was kind of like a one-stop shop for insurance, guidebooks, local knowledge, really anything a motorist could ask for.
Kind of what they would need to get out of the city. Like instead of being like, here's a way to get out of the city, it's like, get out of the city, do this.
Yeah, exactly. And I should clarify that like the Auto Club of Southern California is probably easiest to envision at this time as kind of a counterpart to the Northern California. We have like AAA split into different parts in California today, but the Auto Club of Southern California was popular without even selling auto insurance yet. It was just information and promotion. And so the kind of the earliest roads into Yosemite Valley, the Auto Club of Southern California was really one of the major driving forces behind those.
Would you say that sort of happened after, to use sort of general terms, like after the automobile conquered LA, it moved on to Yosemite, or was it part of that?
That's a really good question, man. I would honestly say it was kind of part of that, because the way the Auto Club operated, a lot of the language that its spokespeople used were kind of like, I think one of their spokespeople said that they were determined to, quote, invade the North, which sounds a bit like a Game of Thrones dialogue snippet, but is in actuality like a statement of their goal. They were going to define Los Angeles not as a city with concrete limits, but as a city whose borders didn't really stop.
Well, it's kind of true now, so I guess it succeeded.
Yeah, it's like foreshadowing in a major way. But I found that pretty fascinating that Yosemite was a major proponent of that expansion. And right around this time, Los Angeles was trying to expand its own reputation as just a winter destination. That was kind of initially its major vacation market because its climate was so mild.
Sort of like a West Coast Florida in a way.
Yeah, Yosemite, as I mentioned before, its administrators were also trying to expand the park's tourist season. So by kind of cooperation between Los Angeles and Yosemite actually allowed both places to kind of broaden their tourist season and thus kind of increase their revenues.
So your third chapter, to just go through these, is about World War II. And that's another association like I wouldn't make with Yosemite, but it affected the park in a dramatic way, right?
So for anybody that's seen the movie The Caine Mutiny, it's based on like the classic novel about World War II. There's a I don't know, maybe 5-minute segment of shore leave that's filmed entirely in Yosemite Valley, and so that's really at the most basic and kind of personal level. Yosemite was a place that people would go with their family or loved ones before they deployed, while they were on leave, or when they came back from the war. Yeah. And a lot of national parks during World War II were pressured by outside influences, especially neighboring cities, to kind of maybe restrict their or loosen their prohibitions on grazing or logging, so that rural communities could make a better living during World War II, right? Because because of fuel and rubber rationing, if you're an isolated community during World War II, like you are not getting, if you're a community on the way to Yosemite, you're not getting the same amount of tourist dollars flowing in.
Yeah, you're kind of screwed.
Exactly. And Yosemite's superintendent fielded a lot of these requests. But most of them came from Merced, which for anybody that's, driven to Yosemite on Highway 140, it's kind of like the last In-N-Out burger before you get to the park.
It's right next to it, too.
Yeah, and it's home of like the newest University of California. Like, I don't mean to pick on it. I actually like Merced quite a bit. But it's one of many communities that has claimed itself as the, quote, gateway to Yosemite. During World War II, Merced's military bases actually consistently sent buses and cars full of soldiers into Yosemite for like training exercises, but also to kind of a more abstract way of inspiring them, to remind them what exactly they were training to fight for.
Damn.
So that's kind of the National Park Service's answer to surrounding communities wanting to harvest natural resources during the war as well. No, we have these more abstract resources that are actually just as valuable, if not more, to the war effort. So even though we're preserving this land, we are actually still doing our part to help people fighting overseas. So it's definitely more of an abstract connection, but you could see why, an organization dedicated to preserving land instead of having it grazed and logged would say that.
Yeah.
And kind of my third chapter about World War II is kind of the exception proves the rule chapter, in that Yosemite actually experienced a massive drop in visitation, like about three quarters drop within a year of beginning. So fuel and rubber rationing is the obvious reason, right?
Mm.
Like you would have to save your fuel, and you would have to save your fuel ration tickets for, many months in order to have enough to visit Yosemite. And that was just not really in the cards for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So there, over Memorial Day weekend, 1943, the park superintendent and some investigators from the Office of Price Administration, kind of the federal agency in charge of rationing, they found that like 300 people were in Yosemite illegally possessing gasoline that wasn't obtained the way it should have been.
Huh.
So that kind of shows you as, we're national parks, really these beacons of inspiration for Americans, kind of reminding them what the fight was all about, or were they actually encouraging them to disregard their, obligations to ration themselves for the greater good and kind of tempt them into the mountains, so to speak. Merced was overall pretty changed forever by World War II, because the railroad that entered Yosemite had already experienced a pretty big decline since highways into Yosemite were built in the 1920s. But World War II plunged this railroad that connected Merced to Yosemite. It plunged it into like an entirely new kind of desperation. And because the superintendent of Yosemite was adamant that no logging be done within the park, that was kind of the cash cow of the railroad. And it ended up essentially going belly up and leaving Merced as, having a much more tenuous connection to Yosemite's tourist dollars. And it also kind of more importantly, sealed the fate of Yosemite as really a cars park. That was really kind of the death of any potential for mass transit to Yosemite.
Yeah.
So even though the kind of prohibition on logging within the park was technically in the name of, the environment, the long-term kind of legacy of that decision is a lot more murky.
Yeah, I was curious about that, the train. You mentioned it a few times, and how was it sort of like born?
Well, so in the 1910s, within a few years of each other, the Yosemite Valley Railroad and the Yosemite Lumber Company were both incorporated, and they're really part and parcel of one another. But basically, if you've driven into Yosemite via the Highway 140 corridor past Merced, you drive alongside the Merced River for the last, I want to say, about 20 to 30 miles until you reach the park gates. And you can see the railroad right away on the opposite side of the river from the highway that you're driving on. But you should always keep your eyes on the roads, kids. Pro tip. But anyways, there was a lot of really profitable sugar pine groves that were near Yosemite, but still on the outside of the park, so legal to log. And the logging company would set up flumes down these really, really steep embankments. And then logs would arrive at train cars, and they would be shipped back to a mill just north of Merced at this place called Merced Falls. And that mill employed thousands of people. It used, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of thousands of eggs and pounds of butter per month. So it's this massive economic engine for Merced, which had not yet really settled into its role as a massive agricultural producer for a state known for agricultural production. So it's really embedded in the fabric of the city of Merced. So its abandonment in 1945 was a pretty massive reckoning for the town's identity.
Yeah, that's ironic because was the airport was downgraded a little bit ago?
Oh man, I don't know, but it sounds like the type of thing that would happen to Merced, unfortunately.
So you talked about the last chapter, which is sort of concerning the hippies, for lack of a better word.
Yep.
And so what's the fourth chapter is about the park coping with sort of traffic after World War II, when it just spiked, right?
Yeah. So after fuel and rubber rationing were done away with after victory over Japan, VJ Day, the park and pretty much most national parks experienced this massive influx of tourists, although their budgets were still operating at pre-World War II levels, right? I mean, just because America was experiencing this massive upswing in prosperity, it doesn't mean that was reflected in federal spending, especially for preservation, right? I think even today, and even under a different administration, the national parks budget would still be a 1/10 of 1% of the federal budget, right? So it's not massive. So dealing with these completely unheard of crowds with completely inadequate funding was really taking a toll on park facilities nationwide, but especially in Yosemite Valley, which during some points in the 1960s actually had a greater population density than San Francisco.
Whoa.
Yeah. And I mean, San Francisco is not exactly known for having a plethora of housing density, right? That's why, the city is having the struggles it does today. But still, I found that pretty wild. So from the late 1940s onward, the National Park Service was trying to find ways to kind of declutter Yosemite Valley, because that's where not just visitors go to enjoy themselves and stay and eat, but that's also where employees have to live, right? That's where employee-only facilities like office buildings exist.
Now, hold on a second. So you're saying it was similar density to San Francisco. What was the population?
The population, man, it's really hard because, as is the case today, kind of like my job, so many people come and go during the summer months. So it's kind of almost like a college town in inverse. So I did it, man, I could pull up that Excel file, honestly, but I think we're talking about about 10,000 people, that magnitude. Yeah, so I know that
at any given time.
At any given time.
Wow.
Even today, on a busy summer weekend, there's a magic number of cars that leads to gridlock, and I think it's around. I want to say it's around 3,000. But yeah. So, but anyways, the Yosemite Valley was, it's the kind of the hub of the American conservation movement, but it was being totally overrun. So due to this massive upswing in park spending called Mission 66, which is basically money for parks to update their infrastructure, their lodging, highway plans, etc., Yosemite's brain trust began to devise ways to declutter Yosemite Valley, because really the only other option was to move the park's administrative headquarters to some city like Fresno. And even people that wanted to see Yosemite Valley, restored to a bit more natural estate. Again, I'm doing scare quotes. You can't see that, but natural is pretty relative. So there's an employee community called El Portel, which is just west of the park boundary on Highway 140. And the Park Service purchased that in the late 50s and began relocating employee housing there. So they actually made first a bunch of trailer courts, and then, for lack of a better word, like post-war suburbs for employees to live there. And people that wanted to, obtain housing there, they went through, like they still do today, a process where, you get a certain amount of points for how long you've been with the Park Service, a certain amount of points for how many kids you have, a certain amount of points for how much money you make, etc. Housing has always been a really complicated issue in Yosemite, but El Portel in the late 50s was this massive victory for not only being able to move employees out of the valley and ostensibly out of tourist view sheds, but also being able to create essentially like a company town that was in a reasonable commuting distance and would allow the Park Service to retain employees with families who are technically more stable, right? Well, basically, like most of my chapters are about Yosemite's relationship with a certain city, but this fourth chapter is really just about how the suburban form, so popular in post-war California, like these isolated residential communities requiring a longer drive to and from work. It's really about how that suburban form came to a place that we kind of regard as the epitome of natural beauty.
So, when you complete the dissertation, are you looking to publish? Because honestly, this is really interesting stuff, and I think a lot of people would be interested in reading about it.
I definitely am. Yeah, that's kind of the one of the most important tasks you have to do if you're seeking any kind of academic job at a four-year school. So yeah, I've been talking to presses about it, and there are a few that are very interested, especially given that it's kind of a slightly non-traditional take on a place that many Americans are at the very least familiar with, if not very fond of. Yeah,
there's a lot of name recognition.
Yeah, so I'm lucky in that my topic doesn't really suffer from like the obscurity that a lot of people's do, like maybe, but there's also other problems, right? I mean, like there's a lot of people that might think that this is kind of not an appropriate way to look at Yosemite, that, like this is not reverential enough, but, it's not really for me to say. If it is published, then that would be really nice. But first I need to defend my dissertation. That's kind of the goal, right? I need to please my committee and make sure that I actually get my PhD before I go.
That's important.
Yeah.
Oh, I wanted to cover real fast. So Fresno has a airport called Fresno Yosemite International.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of curious about not so much the demographics of the Californians, but as far as the 10% that you said come from outside of California, what are some patterns that you've noticed as a ranger, as far as who comes that it's not convenient to show up?
Europeans and specifically Germans are absolutely vociferous about Yosemite. Really? Yeah, for sure. Every once in a while I get to work at an entrance station, just filling in for someone. And I'll never forget seeing a pack of dudes drive up on Harleys blaring Bob Seger. And they're wearing the full cut off leather vest with fringed leggings. And then when they get to the window, they ask for a map in German.
Whoa. That's a trip.
Yeah. I mean, God, this is a book topic for somebody that maybe has already been written, but Germans really like kind of the mythic American West, the romance of the frontier and all that jazz. But yeah, I would say Germans are what stick out in my mind as kind of the most numerous non-Californians.
Damn.
Also, I just need to point out that I'm kind of disappointed that the airport is named Fresno Yosemite International, just because I think the airport code is still FAT, F-A-T.
Yeah.
So, we can dream, right?
FYI.
Dude, absolutely.
Oh, man. So what about your plans beyond the dissertation? You mentioned that you were interested in writing a project about Northern California potentially.
Yeah, so I'm applying for academic jobs right now, and one of the big ingredients that you need in your application materials is like any kind of indication that you've thought about a next research project, right? Because you can only mine your dissertation for so many articles, so many conference papers before you need to move on. And
yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, exactly. Something that's always fascinated me growing up in kind of the Southern Bay Area is the role of Highway 17, which is kind of this gnarly but incredibly important mountain road that connects like the Santa Cruz Bay Area with the Silicon Valley area. So there's kind of implicitly almost like an earnings limit if you live in Santa Cruz and do not plan on commuting. It's like you could have the same job in both places, but you'll be taking a 10 to 20% pay cut by not commuting to San Jose. So I think kind of what I really want to do is a longue durée history of that. And longue durée is probably a French word I'm mispronouncing, but there's a school of historians earlier in the 20th century called the Annales School, and they like to study history without the major kind of political and military junctures that tend to characterize so much of what we learn about history. So instead of focusing on like regime change or like some kind of authoritarian figure within a church, they would focus on like the price of olive oil over 1,000 years. Yeah. And that sounds insane as a project, but it's also really cool to see what trends emerge when you take away, the military, the political aspect that oftentimes is, not really the most fascinating stuff anyway. So
that's honestly kind of what the other past is in
right?
ways. Yeah, totally. So I vibe with that. Thumbs up.
Thanks, man. So I want to do a history of the Highway 17 corridor from when the Spaniards envisioned it as a more efficient way to connect the Santa Cruz and San Jose missions. And of course, they were going to use native labor to do that. They're saying, and then the transition into the railroad era, where a lot of Chinese laborers were brought in to do some incredibly dangerous dynamiting in the hillside that ended up costing a lot of lives, and then to today, where it's basically the highway to the tech industry. I mean, it's basically like the official highway of the tech professional. Just investigating that change over time. And like I said earlier, that's the way my brain works, is just investigating kind of abstract connections between places that are distant.
I believe that part of El Camino Real kind of parallels 17, or 17 is sort of related to that. I recently found out that El Camino Real is also based on an indigenous American trade route, which is like a trip.
Right? Yeah, these corridors, they don't usually just stay relevant for one historical period, right? Like I'm actually teaching or collaboratively teaching a class on like the Santa Fe Trail, which ran from Missouri to Santa Fe during the time when New Mexico was still Mexican. And it's really interesting to see interpretive materials that say like the Santa Fe Trail was like invented by this merchant from Missouri, and it's like, well, kind of, but also, he was using trails that had been there before him, right? Like, highways, we think of highways as asphalt covered, but like Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, that had highways stretching multiple directions because it was such an important trade destination. So it's, if you fix your terminology a little more exactly, you'll kind of see that, these routes through landscapes have historical echoes. Yeah.
So to wrap things up, right now in Northern California, it's extremely smoky here. And I know that Yosemite was on fire, or much of it, for this summer. So I'm kind of wondering about the future of Yosemite, in the sense of, like, people tend to think of wildfires as associated with hot weather, and hot weather is increasing due to climate change. So where do you see the future of wildfires in Yosemite and general weather affecting Yosemite?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because as like Park Service employees, you are given a pretty strict instructions to not engage in politics, right? Like if somebody came up and it's like, who's your pick for the Secretary of the Interior? You couldn't say that. But we have stacks of brochures on climate change that we are encouraged to hand out. And so that kind of speaks to the agency's stance as like a bit of a rebel agent in the government today. So yeah, I mean, I think in terms of climate change, you can't really help but point out the fact that Yosemite exists basically by the grace of the automobile, right? Like there's this really complicated connection between using internal combustion technology to experience a natural space. And that is, I mean, Zion is kind of the ideal national park for that because there's by and large like major parking areas and shuttle service to everywhere in the park. North Cascades is also kind of like that. But Yosemite, despite its wonderful traits, transportation innovation is not one of them. I think there's the Yosemite Area Rapid Transit, or YARTS, that was initiated, I think, in the 90s. That's just really like a bus system that connects like Merced, for example, with Yosemite Valley. And I think that's a massive step forward. But yeah, the first coming to terms with the park's over-reliance on the car and figuring out some way to still remain open to the public because it is taxpayer funded without just allowing anybody that wants to go on any given day to put a car into Yosemite Valley is the goal. I know that, I'm saying this like it's so easy to figure out that solution. It's not. And many brighter people than me have failed to do it. But I think what I can do, or a study like mine can do, is just kind of expose. Everybody knows that Yosemite and cars are like joined at the hip, but I think there's a deeper kind of cultural association about, is Yosemite really an isolated place, or is it just is it really kind of the sum of all these other places that are connected to it by, 4-lane highways? So, we're seeing the fire return interval really decrease, meaning that fires will recur more frequently in especially kind of the lower elevations, 4,000 feet and lower, in the really dense conifer forests, especially on the park's kind of southern and western aspects. That's where the Ferguson fire was this summer. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting how when you pull on something environmental like that, you create those fires create denuded steep hillsides that filter into the Merced River Canyon. And I know I have friends that live in El Portal, that employee community I mentioned earlier. And if we do get heavy rains as are forecasted this winter, then that could turn into a major mudslide hazard. So it's even though the park, is a paragon of automotive accessibility, there's also probably a lot of flexibility that will be required both on the part of like visitors and bureaucrats in the coming summers as far as what entrances are going to remain stable and safe. I think at one point this past summer, 3 of the 4 entrances to the park were closed.
Yeah, that's so I'm curious about what I mentioned that was not exactly relevant about the car sort of growing based on Yosemite and then LA. Do you think that the automobile piggybacked on what you research about Yosemite to sort of gain more prominence in the United States?
Let's see, man. That is a good question.
And I also mentioned a while ago talking to you, Vegas is another location that probably was pushed by the automobile club. And I was just curious, I'm just wondering if Yosemite played what role Yosemite played in the expansion of the automobile as an American thing.
Interesting, man. Well, yeah, so I think to your point on Vegas, I'm actually relatively certain that the Auto Club of Southern California did sign at least part of the route to Vegas from LA. So your nose is picking up the right scent, so to speak. As far as creating more of the American automobile ethos, I think the most convincing argument I could think of is returning back to World War II and how millions of auto-owned Americans were forced to confront fuel and rubber rationing and kind of these really drastic reductions in their mobility. Mm-hmm. And you really can take that one of, the after effects of that, because obviously, spoiler alert, people don't curtail their automotive mobility today, right? Like that was federally enforced. Now it's not. people, you can either think that that reduction in mobility made people really cognizant of, wow, like a car is a sometimes resource and I should use it very sparingly and I should always carpool. Or you could take it as people really realizing that because of just how affected they were by these reductions, that an automobile is an essential part of being an American, and that it's an essential part of your individuality, and that that's part of your sacrifice of the war, is that you're not getting to exercise that for 3 odd years. And I think that especially in places like Yosemite, with the history of the kind of like the wilderness movement, the conservation and preservation movements, and the automobile all being stuck so thoroughly together, it really does show that like the automobile as an accessory to any type of activity, like it's done an incredibly effective job of ingratiating itself into all these different conversations, despite some very obvious ironies. For example, needing fossil fuels to access the wilderness, right? I mean, that's kind of nutty when you think about it, but it's indispensable, and we don't know any other way.
You know, I kind of have always wondered, I mean, West Texas, I'm sure, has a number of natural features that would be amazing, and I've always wondered whether or not the lack of national parks in Texas, or certainly that part of Texas, is due to the oil boom in Texas and the fact that they export probably things that they need under a national park if we're to be declared.
Yeah, I think that would be an awesome study, right? Places you could kind of like, there's like a food desert, you could look up park deserts, right? Like the places that are farthest from national parks in America. And are they really like just ugly and sinful and not worth visiting? Probably not. Yeah, no, that's an awesome idea. Do you mind if I steal that?
Yeah, actually, I'm already writing it. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything.
Yeah, dude, you spoke too soon.
Yeah, and to finish this up, there's uranium mining potential in the Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
And Grand Canyon is kind of the national park, no offense to Yosemite, but do you think that anything like that has any chance of happening in Yosemite?
Man, so this is something I think about a lot, especially given the current political climate. And sometimes visitors, like I said, I'm not allowed to be super politically candid with visitors, but sometimes they will ask me, like, what do you think? Like, is Yosemite, under threat for capitalist exploitation? And I mean, I kind of like go full wet blanket at that point in the conversation. And I say, like, well, I mean, the National Park Service is the concessioners that operate in national parks selling showers, hot dogs, lodging. They are licensed monopolies operating within our economic system. That is, if you talk to like Theodore Roosevelt, you can't, spoiler alert. They are not, like, monopolies are not supposed to happen, right? Yeah. So what does it say? Like, I mean, national parks are already these massive engines for capitalist development, not just within the parks themselves and within the concessioners, but also if you look at the economic footprint that they radiate outwards dollar signs for, all these rural communities that, get Airbnb revenues, like meal revenues, lodging revenues, gas revenues. So I would say that, I mean, God, not to just sound like a total relativist, but I think it really does depend on what your definition of mining is. Like, I think national parks have been mined pretty thoroughly already.
You say that there's a Yosemite metropolitan area. That's sort of a central theme of the dissertation. How far would you say that spreads, putting you on the spot here?
All right. So, I mean, like, of the places that I've written about so far, LA is the farthest, which is, plus or minus 300 miles south of Yosemite. I have not found anything about like San Diego area, but I'm sure that kind of tie exists. Let's see. I'm trying to think of another. I mean, I know that especially if you're a tourist from Europe, Vegas to Death Valley to Yosemite is like a super common part of the circuit. Yeah. And I don't know the exact space, like, as the crow flies distance between Yosemite and Vegas, but I'd say that there's a major connection there, especially if you're piggybacking on the connection with Southern California, because that right there, right, is kind of its own tourist circuit. So let's say 300 miles or infinity.
Yeah. And I was going to say Germany is pretty far.
Yeah, right.
Well, thanks for coming on, man.
All right, appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. It was good fun.
Definitely. Right on, man. Take it easy.
You too.
Again, my guest has been Guy McClellan. I don't know what the title of the book will be when it comes out, but I will provide a link when it does. Thank you for listening, and I apologize to Los Angeles. Your greater metropolitan area is substantially bigger than South Carolina. This has been The Other Past, and we'll be back soon.